We're constantly told the world is becoming more unpredictable. Politics feels unstable. Economies lurch from one shock to the next. Technology's moving faster than most people can adapt. And if you follow the headlines, it can feel like planning ahead, especially in property and investing and in business, is almost impossible. But here's the paradox. While the noise keeps getting louder, many of the forces that actually drive our housing markets, our population growth, long-term wealth creation, in fact, business, are slow, structural, and surprisingly predictable. And that's why today's episode of Demographics Decoded is going to be a little bit different. About 12 months ago, Kuestenmacher published a detailed set of demographic predictions about Australia's future, covering everything from migration, ageing, housing affordability, consumer behaviour, and where population growth would show up. And instead of quietly moving on, he's bravely decided to come back 12 months later to mark his own homework. So welcome to this week's episode of Demographics Decoded, the show that unveils the trends shaping our future. Hi, I'm Michael Yardney, and joining me, as always, is leading demographer Kuestenmacher. And together, each week, we dig beneath the data to uncover the trends that are shaping our economy, our communities, our future prosperity, and what that means for your business, for your investments, and for your future prosperity. Of course, our aim is to help make sense of what's coming next so you can make smarter decisions. But this week, we're going to look at what did demographics get right and where did reality diverge from the forecasts? And most importantly, for business owners and property investors, what does this tell us about how we should be positioning ourselves when the future feels chaotic, but the fundamentals haven't really changed? Simon, you're very brave saying, okay, please let's mark my homework publicly.
Yeah, it's against common sense because we say in forecasting, make your forecasts and never ever have people check whether you were correct. But I figured, let's do it. Let's actually see how this turned out. And overall, there were 20 demographic forecasts that I made over two columns in December last year. And so I figured, let's have a look. And let's figure out what this actually is about. Add a bit of accountability to the normal storytelling that is in there. And let's see how I've done.
Well, we say that demographics is a great crystal ball for checking the future, and it's sometimes hard to make short-term predictions. Other good demographic trends give us long-term views. So let's just go through a couple of things. We keep hearing that the world's becoming more chaotic, more unpredictable. After reviewing your predictions, which way do you think things are going?
Well, so it most certainly feels more chaotic. I think that's an important is to understand that you open up the news and you see horrible news stories every day. You see more political uncertainty left and right. And so these kind of shocking news, they resonate an awful lot with us. But there are, of course, those underlying important forces that are always there, that are very easy to forecast. And many of those forecasts that I made were along these lines. Population is aging, migration is high, fertility rates keep falling. Our household formation patterns are pretty simple. That's easy to predict stuff out there. So sometimes when we see a big shocking news story, and these stories are newsworthy because they are extraordinary. They differ from the normal trend that we've been seeing. And then we think that this crazy short-term volatility, that is all there is. And we forget about the long-term certainties that still keep operating.
Well, we're going to go through and tick your scores in a moment, your answers in a moment. But for all our new viewers and listeners, each show has a story of its own to tell about the future. So if you don't currently subscribe to this podcast, please do. And then when you've got time, just go back and listen to or watch some of the old shows so that you can hear some of Simon's thoughts and predictions to help you plan your future. But one of the clear winners that came out was related to the politics, the rise in third-party voting. Why was this such an obvious demographic correct call?
Yeah, this is a long-standing trend that I argued would continue to persist. Third-party votes are all the votes, the primary votes in Australian elections that do not go to the Labour or to the Liberal or coalition parties there. And that vote share was at 2% in 1987, and it rose ever since until at the last election, it actually surpassed a third. So now 34% of us voted for a third party, which is remarkable. And it's just an ongoing trend. And I didn't see any major shift away from that. And so that was a big check mark that I gave myself for having this forecast right. There was, of course, one political forecast that I made very much tongue in cheek, where I said Peter Dutton would become the next prime minister, simply based on the fact that he was 54 years of age at the time of the election, and 54 happens to be the statistical average age of our new prime ministers. And so that, of course, was wrong, that forecast.
Yes, I actually remember we were together at Wealth Retreat when the election was held last year, and then we had a special show straight afterwards. In fact, I'm looking forward to Wealth Retreat this year on the Gold Coast at the end of May, where we're getting together with a group of already successful business people, owner, property investors, and you're going to giving us your predictions and unpacking what's ahead. So that's always gets a great result. But yes, certain things stand out, and I do remember your discussion about what's ahead for the political parties, and you were suggesting that in fact that's only going to rise over the next couple of years.
Utterly convinced. I don't see any major development on the horizon that would ensure that people turn back into the arms of the major parties. The major parties are continuing to operate in a way that alienates at least some part of the votership, and so their vote share continues to fall. This is also very much in line with international observations, where in many, many countries, the major parties that we thought throughout from the end of the Second World War until maybe the 90s, we thought to be the sole parties across Europe, they have massively declining vote shares and new parties emerge. In Australia, these developments are much slower than anywhere else because we have preferential voting and we have compulsory voting. These are two
Yes.
measures that push people into the center rather than to the extremes. I'm actually quite a fan of this voting system because it de-radicalizes our politics. And I think Australia would be, without the system, in a position where it would happily jump from far left votes to far right votes, depending on the
Yes.
mood of the day. So I think it's a good system for us that provides political stability. And the political stability is, of course, needed in a country that doesn't do much. We have a very undiverse economy.
You're going to offend somebody there.
Defending might offend a couple of people, but most Australians understand that we do mining, agriculture, tourism, international education. That's where the money comes from.
Yes.
And in this system, you want stability to make sure that the foreign capital comes into the country and that big investments in agriculture and mining in particular, they are stable. And a stable political environment is what this money wants. And so we rely on the stability of the institutions, and weakening the two major parties isn't actually in our interest. It opens the gates for political instability, which isn't a good thing. I'm not saying that we will be a nation of chaos or anything like this if another party becomes prime minister, but that's not really that's for another column, this forecast.
It is. Okay. Now, a lot of was talked about migration over the last years, but you did make some suggestions about migration. One of the interesting comments you made, though, was the distinction between arrivals data and actually migration data. What's the difference? What does it matter?
Yeah, so it's of course an iffy topic, very, very highly emotionalized topic. And so when we look at migration data, what we usually talk about is net overseas migration. So it's the difference of permanent settlements
Yes.
that move into Australia and permanent settlements that move out of Australia. And so we got used to a long-term average of almost 250,000 net new migrants, as we say, settling into Australia. So we grow the country by about 250,000 migrants each year. And that's permanent settlements. That's what's important. That's what we get used to. But because this data is reported with such a big lag, sometimes people want to look at more up-to-date, more frequent data to get a bit of a sense of how things are moving. And that is arrival data, because people arrive at ports or at
Yes.
airports in Australia, and these numbers can vary quite significantly. And they're much, much higher than migration numbers. Just statistical logic dictates that they're bigger. And so by just talking about arrivals data, you create the sense of migration having gone even crazier than you think it has been. And so it can be misused. So I'm always saying, look at the same consistent set of data to tell a clear story. And so you understand that's the important number, not the arrivals data, because otherwise it's very easy to get caught into some sort of very emotional argument about migration gets too high, we're being flooded. And that's, of course, gets very much weaponized by One Nation, by the far right, by now X, Twitter very much pushes these narratives like crazy. It's comical how much they're emphasized on this platform in particular. So be it. And I always ask people to stay calm, look at the net overseas migration data, and take a deep breath in the meantime.
Well, another correct prediction you had was about falling fertility rates. We've done a couple of shows about that. How did that turn out this year?
Yeah, that very much was correct. So birth rates, fertility rates, in the total fertility rate is the technical term, that keeps falling. It's very predictable because people make babies later in life, because we send more young people, particularly young women, into ever longer degrees at university. That puts first childbirth further out. That minimizes the amount of time that you have to make babies. And of course, the willingness to have more than one kid in particular is linked to the sense of optimism about the future of the household. So if a household thinks that they will be richer forever onwards, that housing is easily affordable, they might well add a second or a third kid to their small family. If households think that housing will be getting ever more expensive, that the costs of raising children will only escalate, that if they're not so sure about their own economic future, will my job be eaten up by AI? These kind of questions, then they think that it might be safer to just keep it at one or two kids. And that trend, the lack of optimism, further drives down birth rates. I saw no trend that suggests that young people get more optimistic about their future. So it was very easy to forecast those falling fertility rates. But of course, this does not lead to low birth numbers at the moment, at least, because we now are in the period of history where the big millennial generation makes babies at scale.
Yes.
And if the biggest generation ever makes babies at a lower rate, you still have very busy maternity wards.
Now, one of the other predictions you got right was about unemployment. You predicted unemployment would fall comfortably below 5%. I remember a number of years ago, there was a concern that it would rise. Obviously, it's one of the things the Reserve Bank's been keeping a careful eye on, and the media does as well.
Yeah, so unemployment is relatively easy to forecast demographically speaking, because we keep running out of workers. And if we keep running out of workers, we'll find jobs for the, maybe a bit harder to employ people. We'll manage to do that. And if unemployment was ever to spiral out of control, meaning you rise to 6% or something like this, and we would just stop migration intake. It would slow this down significantly. So that was an easy forecast. We are still at just over 4%. And I would predict this to be the case for the foreseeable future.
And at the same time, a very high participation rate. It's dropped a little bit, the most recent figures, but still relatively very high. Let's have a talk about property. A lot of people listening to this, watching us, are interested in property. And you made a couple of predictions. One was that growth in the outer greenfield areas would outpace infill development. What was your thought process behind that, which was, of course, correct?
Well, so this has to do with simple pricing logic. If you were only to read the urban planning documents of Melbourne, Sydney, Adelaide, Perth, whatever, you would think that infill development, infill population will be the main game, meaning we put more people into medium and high density dwellings and fewer people on the outskirts of the additional population in the country, because this is what urban planners want. They want to make sure that we live in a more denser way so that we need less new infrastructure, because at the moment, infrastructure is particularly difficult and expensive to build. So let's minimize this by building more density. Makes perfect sense from a planning perspective. But market reality is that building a square meter of housing on a greenfield site on the outskirts of town is about half the cost per square meter of housing compared to a medium or high density square meter of housing. And so if you grow a country by 350,000 people each year, which is a lot of people, are you going to build the faster and cheaper way of housing on the outskirts of town, or are you building the more expensive and slower way of housing? It's a no-brainer that this is still an environment where we favor the greenfield, the outskirts of town over the inner city.
You also predicted that Melbourne would become the cheapest capital city in Australia. You were sort of right that Melbourne's growth was slower than most other places, but Hobart has remained the cheapest capital city.
Yeah, and so in hindsight, I was a bit unhappy with my forecast here because it was sloppy. So I said the cheapest of all the capital cities, and it's unrealistic that a big city like Melbourne ever falls below the price level of a small place like Hobart. That made no sense whatsoever. But it is true that Melbourne's house prices grew at a much lower rate than all of the other areas, and that it is now housing in Adelaide, Brisbane, Sydney, Perth is actually more expensive than it is in Melbourne. And the reason for that is linked to the greenfield housing logic, where we say in Melbourne, there are no physical boundaries that are hemming in the population. So you can build up north endlessly, you can build out west endlessly. So there's plenty of land available to build cheap housing. And that's what Melbourne has done. And if you build a lot of housing at the cheapest type of housing type, that of course means that prices go down or don't grow as much. And so therefore it becomes more affordable. Of course, also you get a better wage in Melbourne than you do in Hobart. So it might well be more affordable. It's not cheaper though. So this is where my sloppiness in the forecast haunted me a bit.
Well, another housing prediction was that first home buyers are going to continue to getting older. I guess that's definitely happened. However, in the last election, the Prime Minister promised to have these first homeowner grants. We've discussed them before, the 5% homeowner grant and now some shared equity grants. That may change it a little bit, bringing first homeowner ages down a bit. But in general, people are leaving these bigger decisions for later, Simon.
Exactly, because there's also other trends that go into this other than the pure financials. It's also you tend to buy your first home for you and your family, not necessarily for yourself. Of course, there are plenty of single people who buy a house, an apartment, so to speak, but most commonly you buy the first home as a family home. And if we push out family formation ever later, this should also, even if housing was much more affordable than it is, it would lead to first home buyer age being pushed back.
Well, there was another prediction that I guess was pretty easy to make, and that Australia is going to be getting older.
Exactly. I almost felt bad about this
Bring that
forecast.
one in, yes.
It is so obvious. It was an easy one. Yes, we are getting older. Theoretically, of course, Australia could get younger if we were to take in gigantic amounts of young people. Young people tend to be much younger than the median age of Australia. And so that would have led to a rejuvenation of the country, but that didn't occur. Every now and then in those forecasts, you need to throw in a couple of easy ones. That most certainly was one of the easy ones.
Well, one of the ones that you missed was about car sales. Demographic logic made sense, but reality didn't cooperate. What went wrong?
Yep. So what I argued is that this is a very car heavy decade because we take the millennials out of their inner city hipster suburbs where they live as couples and might cycle to work, might take a tram to work, and we put them with their families onto the urban fringe over the next decade, which
Yes.
are car dependent areas. And statistically speaking, we push the millennials from the one car per household phase into the multiple cars per household phase of the life cycle. So that should drive up the number of cars needed at the same, which I argued would translate into car sales in some way or another. And of course, for now, the baby boomers continue to drive vehicles for the next decade. They are not downsizing. They're not downsizing enough to need fewer cars. They are still too healthy to actually give up driving for health reasons. So all pointed into that favor. What I did not account for is just consumer behavior was stronger in a sense that we allowed our cars to get older. We simply delayed the upgrading of cars because cost of living pressures were very real. And in these kind of environments, you look at what kind of costs can you postpone, and you can postpone your car. So the average car in Australia 10 years ago was 10 years of age. Now it is 11 years of age. And so if you think about this, let's say you have in 2024, you have a car from 2014. Even if it's a cheap Hyundai or Kia, they're great cars.
Yes.
They continue to work just fine. So you don't need a new car. You might want a new car, but if money is tight, your car will easily go for another 4 or 5 years. And that's what people seem to be doing. They seem to delay these big purchases. And so I got that wrong. And car sales fell by a little bit, not much, but they fell by a little bit rather than increased.
One of the things you did predict correctly was that electronic vehicles would become more popular. They seem to be around, even though there's mixed messages in the media about batteries and battery life. But you see more and more of these electric vehicles, don't you?
Exactly. And these forecasts, of course, we need to put this into perspective. When I made the forecast that a bigger share of new vehicles will be EV, that's because in 24 it was just over 6% of new vehicle sales that were EVs. We're now to just under 8% or something like this. So it's not an awful lot. So it's relatively easy to make these forecasts, particularly since we know that many companies agreed that their fleets will be electrified. And
Yes.
so you renew a fleet every couple of years only. And so you know that there's this big surge of fleets that need to be renewed each year. And if you know that you keep your fleet through leasing, maybe for 3, 4, 5 years, and you signed agreements that by 2030, your whole fleet is electric, which many companies did, then we need to, with the next renewal cycle, we need to make the fleet EV, or at least a big chunk of the fleet EV. And so that's what is taking place. So even if you and I buy combustion engines, that won't make too much of a difference because the EV fleets, that'll drive the share higher and higher of EVs in the system.
Well, we're talking about your predictions and your forecasts. For people who don't know what you do, you're a demographer. How do you use this every day with your clients?
Well, so I do just that. I make forecasts based on hard demographic data, and every now and then data is published with forecasts. For example, population data has forecasts that are pretty reliable. And so the argument then is, well, if we put that many more people into a particular age group or fewer people into that particular age group, what kind of impact might this have on your business, dear customer of mine, dear audience that I'm speaking to at an event, dear boardroom that I'm, working with on a strategy day? And that's how I spend my day when I'm not podcasting.
If people want to get the benefit of your advice, experience and research, I'll leave a link in the show notes so they can get in contact with your team at the Demographics Group to help you present to their board, to their organisation, to their institution. And for those interested in property, we use all this demographic data to help decide where property markets are moving. But our job as Metropole Property Strategists is to help our clients grow, protect and pass on their wealth. And while we've been voted Australia's leading buyers agents, most trusted buyers agents at the end of last year through a Finder competition, we didn't even enter it, but we were told we won those awards. We're much more than buyers agents. We start strategically helping our clients plan to become the investors they plan to become, putting a plan together for them and then helping them implement that. If you'd like to take advantage of our housing markets in 2026, I'll leave a link in the show notes. Go to metropole.com.au and have a chat. Why not discuss your options and see how you can safely build your financial future? Now, talk about financials and futures. You also made some predictions on interest rates, and they were broadly right on interest rates normalizing, but inflation didn't really behave as you expected, Simon.
Exactly. When I made this forecast, I was a bit optimistic that inflation would ease. And again, there was a forecast that was a bit sloppy in. First and foremost, 2 forecasts, 2 kind of data points in one forecast. That was a mess. So I need to be more clear in writing that particular forecast. But so the idea is, if you look over the last year, inflation increased rather than decreased, but interest rates fell. We had 3 cuts of the cash rate in the last year. So I got the inflation argument wrong and I got the cash rate argument right. But why I'm actually a bit peeved with myself there is that I got another argument right. This is the idea that consumption was going to be very high simply because millennials are in the high consumption phase of the life cycle and they're the biggest generation. And so that incredibly high consumption pattern is, of course, inflationary in nature. And I didn't take that into account when I had a quick think about the inflation figure. So I should have factored that in more closely. So that was definitely a mixed message. I gave this to myself as a loss. You got to be critical.
You're marking yourself very harshly, Simon, because retail spending did definitely go up, as you said, at a time when a lot of people were still complaining about the cost of living. Simon, also, as you predicted, inbound tourism numbers grew in 2025. They were stronger than the year before.
Yeah, and that was easy because we're still in a recovery phase. Australia remains a very attractive destination because we are close to this big chunk of tourists that is the new created global Asian middle class that wants to entertain themselves, that also want to visit their kids that are international students here. And of course, the Australian dollar is rather low or high, depending on which direction you look at it. But it is very attractive for foreign currencies to travel to Australia. Australia is always a big trip for people because it requires a big flight, which is a big ticket, a big part of the cost of a travel trip. And so for Europeans, Latin Americans, whoever it is, the Asians as well, a cheaper dollar makes for a cheaper trip to Australia. So might as well tick Australia off the bucket list now.
We also correctly predicted increased geopolitical instability. I don't remember a time in my history when things have been so uncertain geopolitically.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I was right on this, but that's because we are rejigging a whole system. And so at the moment, we haven't found a new equilibrium. So if you think about the Cold War world, yes, there were conflicts left, right, and center, but you kind of knew what was happening. There are two big powers eyeing each other off, and every country kind of needs to fall in line. And now certain geopolitical analysts call of the G0 world, the leaderless world, where the US is redrawing their troops, their influence from around the world. And so that creates power vacuums. These power vacuums must be filled. All the while, there is this big power play between the US and China. And so there's lots and lots of realignment happening. And that takes all different weird forms. Yeah, so political tensions therefore get worse or increase. Let's just stay neutral. They increase.
Another forecast you got right, looking at something totally different, was a strong year for indoor play centres. I guess it's the way we're living. We're trading backyards for balconies and courtyards.
Absolutely. So an indoor play center is just, if you don't have kids of that age, it's just a big fat industrial space with big slides and ball pits and trampolines, these kind of things where kids can be wild. They tend to have a cafe associated with it where the parents can, eat a muffin, have a coffee and work on a laptop as well while the kids play. And these things are third spaces that we need because many families now live in smaller and smaller homes where it's just hard to do this. And the play center fulfills so many more needs of just offering the space. It's also it's this weird compromise between letting your kids actually play unsupervised and having them supervised. So you go into this kind of like, chained off box that your kids can be safe in. These are safe spaces, but the parent can still be on their phone or on their laptop and have their kids play. And that's what parenting preferences demand. That's what our built environment, our car-dependent urban fringe areas that we're pushing our young families in demand. So the future is very, very bright for indoor play centers. By now, almost every new shopping center that we're building has one of them.
Well, the shopping centres do as well, don't they? So even the older ones have now refurbished things so that they've got that. In fact, the time we're recording this, tomorrow, I'm taking my grandkids to a big shopping centre because when we're recording this, it's school holidays. And there's a 10-pin bowling alley inside there now in Southland. They've moved it from being central to within the shopping centre. So I'm taking them to a shopping centre to go 10-pin bowling. Interesting.
And that's the goal. That's the retail strategy is to of course get the play activity happening there. Also, if your kids are old enough, throw them in there, do your shopping. It fills certain kind of needs for the time poor parents as well. And so again, absolute bright future for these type of businesses.
You also correctly predicted that the gender pay gap would continue to narrow. What were the demographic forces behind that, Simon?
So the ultimate demographic forces are that we in Australia, sometimes people might not believe this, but we more or less remunerate education. The more educated you are, the more money you make. As a much oversimplified way, that is still the case statistically. And women are outperforming men on every level of education by a long shot. We even in the late teenage years, early 20s, we have a reverse gender pay gap where women earn more money on average than men, which is no surprise because they are significantly more educated. And so if you just run this through the system, each year the gender pay gap, which still exists, should narrow bit by bit. That's an absolute given, statistically speaking. So I can just lock this forecast in for the next decade plus without even thinking too much about it.
The next forecast you got right also, unfortunately, you're probably going to be able to lock in as well. The unpleasant comment that mental health has gotten worse over the last years.
Yes, or at least recorded mental health. And of course, I gave myself a question mark for this forecast because it is almost impossible to get hard, up-to-date data on this. So the idea is that we've seen the long-standing trend over decades now for mental health becoming more, or poor mental health becoming more prominent. We can measure this by self-reported mental health, by mental health cases in something like insurance claims, healthcare claims, by antidepressants that are being prescribed, the share of the population that had received a antidepressant or mental health related prescription over the last years. The problem is that the latest data is from mid 24, so there is a lag, and I said it would be getting worse in 25. I can only actually check this in another year's time, but there's absolutely nothing in the system that believes me or anyone else to think that this is going to be any different.
And another prediction was the war on vapes would be fought more vigorously in 2025. What did the government do about this?
Well, so the government bit by bit introduced more and more legislations to make sure that it's harder to sell them, meaning you need to sell them in a specific shop. They're a bit more closely managed. Also, we are now slowly understanding that because they of course, vapes were an innovation, a new product as a result of the ban of, or not the ban, the increased difficulty of smoking. You know, the idea of taxing cigarettes more and more, so it becomes more difficult to smoke. So you maybe smoke a bit less. Maybe young people are discouraged from picking up smoking. Vaping was much cheaper per puff, so to speak. So great innovation. And it was marketed as the healthy solution towards smoking. We know that this is absolute terrible vaping. We know there's a study, it's a couple of years old now, but at this point, I think 3 years ago, not a single vape sold in Australia actually had the ingredients in it that was on the label. They had neurotoxins in it. You literally hurt your brain by vaping. It is a god-awful pastime for your health. Do it if you please. It's your health. I'm cool with it. But of course, and I'm saying this tongue in cheek, considering all of those vices, smoking, taking drugs, vaping just looks uncool. And that is not just me saying this. They had a nice big study where they asked about what young people think about vaping, and it is considered increasingly as cringe, as uncool and cringe, which is quite a nice way of putting this. And the young people who vaped went from 18% in 24 to 15% by 2025. So that is a positive health development. Of course, we must learn from the problems that we created in pricing cigarettes to this outrageously expensive level. Now that, of course, it opened up the doors to smuggling cigarettes. And now many people buy a smuggled pack of cigarettes because it's about a third of the cost of the legal pack. And so you don't want to push a product underground. So it's quite the balancing act. You want to make it unattractive through price without making the margins for illegal activity attractive. And so getting this is actually difficult. So you always want to start with a root cause, meaning make the act of an undesirable behavior less attractive by educating people about the health outcomes, by maybe branding it as cringe, which I well and truly think is actually the case. So that is much better than pricing a product out because, again, then you get the illegal activity for sure.
Well, I commend you, Simon, for publicly being prepared to mark your homework. Has this changed how you think about forecasting for the future?
Yeah, in a sense it did, because I know you need to be more clear about it. And if I were to repeat the exercise, I would make sure that I have a data point that I know that when I do the review in a year's time, I can actually review. But of course, the reality of writing a column with 20 forecasts is that You just write it and you don't think about this too much about can I get this and that data point in a year's time. But now I actually would be doing this. And I quite like the idea of fact checking myself because, I got things more right than wrong. I gave myself
Yep.
out of 20, I gave myself 13, got it right. I gave myself 4. I don't really have the data, but I'm probably right. And I gave myself 3 misses. So I think that's a decent success rate.
Much better than many other economic forecasters. Now, you've mentioned a column a couple of times. You write weekly in the New Daily, which is not behind a paywall, so people can get your musings there. You also write in the Australian, and you're going to be presenting at Wealth Retreat. If people actually enjoyed our chat, and this was a little bit different to our normal chats, if you don't currently subscribe to this show, please do click the follow or subscribe button wherever you're watching this. And also, just do us a favor. The one thing we ever ask of you, the only thing we ask of you, just tell somebody else about it, because we like getting this message out to as many people as possible. So as we wrap up today's conversation, Simon, it, I guess, shows me that the future is not anywhere near as random as it feels when you're living through it. The headlines change every day, but the fundamentals really do. And that's why I like discussing these demographics with you, because they move slowly. But that's, I guess, why they're so powerful. By the time a trend is obvious in the media, the opportunity is obviously passed by for some people. But I appreciate you looking at your forecasts. And for property investors, business owners, decision makers, it's a crucial lesson. Make your plans, plan for your plans not to go to plan, but regularly go back and review them and base your plans for your business or your investing on sound long-term fundamentals rather than the short-term ups and downs. Don't make 30-year investment or business decisions on the last 30 minutes of news. I guess that's the real value of demographics, not perfect forecasts, but better judgments. Thanks for your time, Simon.
I'm looking forward to the next episode already.
We'll have a chat again next week, definitely. This Demographics Decoded podcast has been brought to you by Metropole Property Strategists. We provide a complete range of services to help our clients safely create intergenerational wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you're looking to buy an investment property or your next home, why not have a discovery chat with one of our wealth strategists? Just go to metropole.com.au and explore your options. You'll find we're much more than just another buyer's agent. We provide a complete range of services, including property advisory, wealth advisory, home buying, buyer's agency, property management, renovations, and development management services. The team at Metropole will help you with frameworks that I've fine-tuned over 5 decades, and we've been helping clients with for well over 25 years. We're big enough to tip the scales in your favour, but still small enough to care. In between these Demographics Decoded shows, you can follow me on social media, and I suggest you also follow Simon Kuestenmacher. You'll find him regularly posting on all social media platforms. And thanks for spending the last little while with Simon and me. I hope you got some benefit from the show. And if you did, and you know somebody who may also benefit, please tell them about Demographics Decoded. There's a share button on every podcast app. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you're definitely going to be doing us a favour, helping us in our quest to make as many people as possible aware of the demographic changes that are going to be shaping their future. And of course, if you don't currently subscribe, we'd love you to. And of course, any of the information that we've been sharing with you is general information, because we don't know your specific circumstances.